In the fall of 1974, Saturday mornings belonged to one cartoon above all others. Before kids even finished their cereal, they were already glued to the screen, watching a bumbling, karate-chopping dog stumble his way through one crisis after another, and somehow, impossibly, come out on top every single time. That dog was Hong Kong Phooey. And for a few magnificent months, he was the biggest thing on Saturday morning television. The show was a genuine phenomenon, laugh-out-loud funny, culturally savvy, and driven by one of the most charismatic vocal performances in the history of Hanna-Barbera animation. And then, just as quickly as he had arrived, he was gone. Not canceled amid controversy, not pulled for poor ratings, just gone. Finished. Wrapped up after a single season and packed neatly into the syndication vault. The question that haunted a generation of fans was simple: why? The answer takes you deep into the heart of 1970s American pop culture, the mechanics of the Saturday morning cartoon business, the genius of one voice actor, the surprisingly sharp satire baked into what looked like a goofy kid show, and the complicated, uncomfortable legacy that lingers even today. This is the full story of Hong Kong Phooey, his meteoric rise, his abrupt disappearance, and why, decades later, people still can't quite let him go. A world ready to be chopped. To understand why Hong Kong Phooey worked so well, you have to understand the cultural moment he was born into. The mid-1970s were in the grip of a full-blown martial arts craze, the likes of which American pop culture had never seen. Bruce Lee had already transformed from a TV sidekick into a global superstar, his films hitting American shores with a visceral intensity that left audiences stunned. Enter the Dragon, released in 1973, was a crossover smash that brought martial arts cinema fully into the mainstream. Meanwhile, the television series Kung Fu, starring David Carradine as a wandering Shaolin monk, had made the quiet, disciplined martial arts master into a household architect. Every kid in every neighborhood was throwing kicks in the backyard. Martial arts was no longer exotic. It was the coolest thing in the world. This was the opening that Hanna-Barbera, the undisputed kings of Saturday morning animation, had been waiting for. The studio had built its empire on cultural timing. They had given the world the Flintstones when suburban family sitcoms were at their peak. They had launched Scooby-Doo when mystery and counterculture were colliding in fascinating ways. Now they saw another trend ripe for their signature treatment: Kung Fu. Not the serious, reverent kind. The spoofed, exaggerated, cartoonishly lovable kind. They wanted to take this global phenomenon and run it through the Hanna-Barbera filter, which meant turning every earnest convention completely upside down. Early in development, the project even went by the working title Kung Phooey, a name that telegraphed the comedic intention from the very start. The studio reportedly considered placing an existing character into the lead role, with Huckleberry Hound briefly discussed as a candidate, before the creative team decided to build an entirely original character from the ground up. What they needed wasn't just a parody of martial arts. They needed a parody of the entire genre of competent, cool, unflappable heroes. A character who represented the complete opposite of Bruce Lee. Someone clumsy, someone well-meaning, someone who tried with every fiber of his being and still managed to get in his own way at every turn. They needed Penrod, Penry, Pooch. The premise that was both genius and ridiculous. The premise of Hong Kong Phooey was, on its surface, deceptively simple. By day, Penry Pooch was the mild-mannered, thoroughly unremarkable janitor at the local police station, a dog of no particular distinction, constantly getting under the feet of a gruff and permanently irritated Sergeant Flint. He mopped floors, he emptied bins, he shuffled around in the background while real police work happened around him. Nobody noticed him, nobody suspected him. And that, of course, was entirely the point. But whenever the station's dispatcher Rosemary got a call for help, whenever some crime threatened the unnamed city they called home, Penry would duck behind the filing cabinet to make his transformation. The filing cabinet, crucially, was not a smooth or dignified piece of equipment. Penry would dive in, get immediately and hopelessly stuck, and then, after considerable effort, burst out the other side as Hong Kong Phooey, masked crime fighter, and self-proclaimed #1 super guy. The gap between the heroic persona he projected and the chaos he actually embodied was the engine that powered every single episode. His weapon of choice was the Hong Kong Book of Kung Fu, a mystic manual that he consulted with great seriousness before promptly misreading it and executing his moves in completely the wrong way. His vehicle was the Phooey Mobile, a car with the supernatural ability to transform into whatever the plot required at any given moment. A submarine, a rocket, a hang glider. And then there was Spot, his striped cat sidekick, and, in every meaningful sense, the actual hero of the show. While Phooey fumbled and floundered his way through each case, Spot would calmly and brilliantly solve the problem in the background, ensuring that his master would stumble across the solution at exactly the right moment, declare victory, and take all the credit. It was a running gag of astonishing consistency and a surprisingly sharp piece of satire about credit, competence, and the gap between reputation and reality. Every episode delivered the same reliable gags. You knew Penry would get stuck in the filing cabinet. You knew he'd misread his kung fu manual. And you knew that Spot would ingeniously save the day at the last second, leaving Phooey to declare, "That was a fan-frific fully finish." The repetition wasn't a flaw. For its young audience, the predictability was part of the charm, the comfort of knowing exactly how the story would go, while still laughing at every beat along the way. The voice that made it all work. No analysis of Hong Kong Phooey is complete without talking at length about the man who brought him to life. Scatman Crothers, a beloved jazz musician, singer, actor, and entertainer with decades of experience under his belt. Crothers was not the obvious choice for a Saturday morning cartoon, but Hanna-Barbera's casting instincts proved inspired. Crothers gave Phooey a voice that was simultaneously warm, confident, ridiculous, and weirdly lovable. A voice so perfectly calibrated to the character's delusions of grandeur that it made every line funnier by default. The story of how Crothers was cast is one of the more remarkable behind-the-scenes tales in animation history. In a 1986 interview, executive producer Joseph Barbera recalled that he was genuinely concerned the network might not approve of a black man voicing the Asian-themed hero. Rather than forcing a direct confrontation, he devised an elegant solution. He played 5 blind auditions for the network executives, letting each performance stand entirely on its own merits. They overwhelmingly chose Crothers' take, only learning his identity after they had already fallen completely in love with the performance. It was a quiet but pointed piece of maneuvering by Barbera, and it produced the definitive voice of Hong Kong Phooey. The catchy theme song, also performed by Scatman Crothers himself, became one of the most instantly recognizable pieces of Saturday morning television. The moment those first notes hit, every kid watching knew exactly what was coming, and they couldn't wait. Crothers had a rare gift for comedic timing and vocal warmth that turned a fundamentally absurd premise into something genuinely endearing. Phooey wasn't just a funny voice. He was a character you rooted for, even knowing he was going to mess everything up. The explosion, at September 1774, when Hong Kong Phooey premiered on ABC on September 1774, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Kids loved it. The ratings were strong. The character's combination of martial arts energy and self-aware comedy hit exactly the right note for its target audience. In one episode, after Phooey drives the Phooey Mobile directly through wet cement, the construction workers on site call it an honor to have their work ruined by the great Hong Kong Phooey. That kind of absurdist humor, delivered with a completely straight face, was what set the show apart from its contemporaries. The merchandise machine kicked into gear almost immediately. A comic book series appeared. Toys, clothing, and assorted products followed. Hong Kong Phooey was everywhere that fall. On lunchboxes and bedroom walls, in toy stores and comic shops. For those few months of 1974, he was the #1 super guy every kid wanted to be. The show had the unmistakable feel of something that was going to be around for a very long time. A Saturday morning institution in the making, right alongside Scooby-Doo and Yogi Bear. The show premiered on September 7, 1974, and its last new episode aired on December 21, 1974. That is just over 3 months. In that narrow window, Hong Kong Phooey produced a cultural footprint that would prove genuinely durable. Far more durable, as it turned out, than anyone involved in its production might have predicted. The disappearance, why the #1 super guy vanished here, is where the story gets complicated. Because the disappearance of Hong Kong Phooey was not the result of scandal, creative failure, or audience rejection. The show was not cancelled in any meaningful sense of that word. It was not pulled from the air in disgrace or quietly shelved after poor reviews. It ended because it was supposed to end. because that was simply how Hanna-Barbera operated, and understanding that requires understanding the production model that defined Saturday morning animation in the 1970s. Hanna-Barbera was not a creative studio in the way we think of animation studios today. It was an animation factory, a finely tuned machine for producing content at volume and speed. The studio's business model was built around efficiency. They would create a batch of episodes for any given show, run those episodes through their initial broadcast cycle, and then move the entire package into syndication, where a relatively small number of episodes could be repeated almost endlessly across regional stations around the country. This was enormously profitable. A show didn't need to last 5 seasons to be commercially successful. It needed to produce a viable syndication package, and that required a finite, manageable number of episodes. After only 16 half-hour episodes, it was done. In the case of Hong Kong Phooey, that meant 16 half-hour episodes, each containing 2 short story segments, giving the show 31 story segments in total, and that was it. The production order was fulfilled. The episodes were complete. The studio moved on to the next project on its production slate. The fall of Hong Kong Phooey wasn't a dramatic collapse, but a quiet, calculated business decision, one that had very little to do with the show's quality or popularity, and everything to do with the industrial logic of the television business. There is also a creative argument to be made about the show's structural limitations. The main joke, that Phooey is a buffoon and his cat does all the work, was brilliant, but it was a single joke. The formula that made the show so reliable also made it incredibly rigid. Each of the 31 story segments followed the exact same structure. Crime reported, transformation bungled, manual misread, Spot solves everything, Phooey takes credit, catchphrase delivered. How long can a show built on one running gag really last before the premise exhausts itself? The brevity of Hong Kong Phooey's run may have been a business decision, but it was also, perhaps inadvertently, the right creative decision. The show ended before it had the chance to wear out its welcome, the uncomfortable layer beneath the laughs. But the story of Hong Kong Phooey's legacy is not purely about business models and production quotas. There is another layer to the story, a more complicated and more uncomfortable one. While the show was undeniably a parody, it was a parody built on cultural stereotypes that drew criticism even at the time of its broadcast. The hero's name, the gong sound effects, his bonsai-shaped car, his reliance on a mystical ancient book, the Asian-inflected setting, all of these are broad caricatures of Asian culture. These elements were likely not created with any conscious malicious intent, but they are unmistakably products of a less culturally aware era. They have not aged well, and they complicate the nostalgic warmth with which many viewers look back on the show. Some critics have since pointed out that the name of Phooey's alter ego, Penry Pooch, sounds uncomfortably close to penury, meaning extreme poverty. This may have been coincidental, it may have been deliberate. But given that the character was voiced by a prominent black actor, and positioned as a lowly janitor, striving desperately to be taken seriously as a hero, the name choice, accidental or not, places the character at a strange and significant intersection of racial and class signifiers. The character existed at a strange intersection of cultural signifiers, making his legacy far more complex than just a silly cartoon. These are not comfortable observations, but they are honest ones, and they are part of the full picture of what Hong Kong Phooey was and what it represented. The show's setting in a crime-ridden, unnamed city also tapped into the anxieties of 1970s America, a decade defined by urban decay, rising crime rates, and a pervasive sense of social disorder. Hong Kong Phooey City was a chaotic, lawless place that reflected the real anxieties of its era, even as the show treated those anxieties with broad, cheerful comedy. The contrast between the seriousness of the problems and the absurdity of the solution was part of what made the show resonate. But it also means the show was doing more cultural work than it might have appeared on the surface. The final episode and the backdoor pilot. The show's original run ended with the episode Comedy Cowboys, and the choice of final episode was characteristically clever. Rather than simply wrapping up the series with a standard adventure, the Hanna-Barbera team used the finale for a specific strategic purpose. It was a backdoor pilot. This was a common practice in 1970s television, using an episode of an existing show to introduce new characters who could potentially anchor their own spin-off, testing audience reaction without the cost of commissioning an entirely separate pilot. In Comedy Cowboys, Phooey is framed for a crime he didn't commit, and a new heroic trio called the Posse Impossible arrives to clear his name. The Posse Impossible was not a subtle concept. They were clearly designed as potential series leads, with distinct personalities and a group dynamic that could sustain their own adventures. And indeed, the plan worked. Those characters were later spun off into their own segment on another Hanna-Barbera property, the CB Bears. Hong Kong Phooey's farewell episode was simultaneously a finale and an audition, which says something telling about how the studio viewed its characters and its content. Life in syndication. More popular dead than alive. Here is the great paradox of Hong Kong Phooey's legacy. He became more culturally present after his show ended than he had been during his brief original run. His 16 episodes ran in repeats on ABC until 1976, then found new audiences on NBC and later the USA Network. Regional stations pick up the syndication package and played it across the country for years. Children who had never seen the original broadcast grew up watching the repeats and believing Hong Kong Phooey had been running for years, maybe decades. The feeling of the show as a long-running institution was entirely a product of syndication, of the same episodes cycling through the broadcast ecosystem over and over again. This is why the show feels even now like it was on for much longer than it was. The 16 episodes you could have watched in 1974 were the same 16 episodes you could watch in 1979 and 1984. And 1989. The production was finite. The exposure was not. Hanna-Barbera had built a machine that made brevity irrelevant. The show could be commercially and culturally significant for years after it stopped producing new content, as long as the syndication pipeline kept flowing. The Hanna-Barbera All-Star, keeping the character alive beyond syndication. Hong Kong Phooey survived through a series of guest appearances and crossovers that kept the character visible in the Hanna-Barbera universe. In 1977, Scatman Crothers returned to voice the character for Laugh-A-Limix, known in production as Laugh-A-Limix, an ambitious crossover series that brought together virtually every major Hanna-Barbera character in an animated Olympic-style competition. Hong Kong Phooey served as a key member of the Scooby-Doo team, which tells you something about his status in the studio's hierarchy of characters. He was considered important enough to anchor an ensemble alongside Scooby-Doo himself. That is not nothing. Decades later, the character received a more substantial reimagining when he appeared in the 2017 reboot of Wacky Races, this time reconceived as a genuinely skilled martial artist rather than a hopeless incompetent. The decision to strip away the central joke of his incompetence and play him as legitimately capable was a significant creative choice, one that divided longtime fans. Some appreciated the evolution. Others felt it fundamentally misunderstood what had made the character compelling in the first place. But either way, the character was still alive and still being adapted, still relevant enough to include in a new production nearly half a century after his debut. Eddie Murphy and the Lost Movie. The strangest chapter in Hong Kong Phooey's post-show history might be the film that never existed, but almost did. At some point in the mid-2000s, a live-action and CGI hybrid feature film was reported to be in active development. The star attached to voice the title character was Eddie Murphy, at that point one of the most bankable comedy stars in Hollywood, with a string of animated successes behind him, including his iconic turn as Donkey in Shrek. The pairing made a certain intuitive sense. Murphy's brand of charismatic, fast-talking, lovably overconfident comedy mapped naturally onto Phooey's delusional heroics. Test footage was eventually leaked online around 2012, showing a CGI-rendered Hong Kong Phooey cracking jokes and striking poses in a live-action lull. The clip circulated widely, generating genuine excitement among fans who had grown up with the character. But despite the buzz, the project quietly fell apart. No official explanation was ever given for the film's collapse. No replacement production was announced. The movie simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only leaked test footage and a generation of fans wondering what might have been. It remains one of the more tantalizing what-ifs in the history of animated character adaptations. The real legacy, more than just a silly cartoon. The rise and fall of Hong Kong Phooey wasn't really a fall at all, but more of a sudden stop. He didn't collapse under the weight of declining ratings or creative exhaustion. He didn't burn out or get canceled in disgrace. He simply stopped being made, because the system that created him was designed to stop making things and move on. And then, quietly and persistently, the culture refused to let him go. Hong Kong Phooey may have only had a brief moment in the spotlight, but he proved that even a #1 super guy with a short run could leave a fanfrific and very strange legacy that lasts a lifetime. He was a massive hit born from a perfect storm, the 1970s kung fu craze colliding with Hanna-Barbera's hit-making formula, wrapped around a genuinely brilliant performance from Scatman Crothers and a structural joke, the incompetent hero. The invisible genius that tapped into something universal. We have all felt like Henry Pooch at some point, trying desperately to be the hero, fumbling the execution, and somehow stumbling across the finish line anyway. That feeling doesn't expire. It doesn't get cancelled. It just keeps running and repeats. The show's disappearance after one season wasn't a failure. It was standard practice for the cartoon production line of the era. What wasn't standard was the depth of the impression it left. For a show that produced only 16 half-hour episodes across fewer than 4 months of original broadcast, Hong Kong Phooey generated a cultural footprint wildly disproportionate to its runtime. It spawned merchandise, comic books, decades of syndication, crossover appearances, a stillborn Hollywood film, and a fandom that has remained genuinely passionate about a karate-chopping janitor dog for 50 years and counting. And at the center of all of it, Scatman Crothers, delivering one of the most quietly remarkable vocal performances in the history of Saturday morning television, in a role he almost didn't get, for a show that was almost never made, that lasted barely 3 months, and somehow lasted a lifetime. Henry Pooch got stuck in the filing cabinet every